And thank you. Thank you, Clerk Moss. My name is Marcus Mundy, and welcome. I am the Executive Director of the Coalition of Communities of Color. We are a member of the Washington County Racial Equity Collaborative, but today I am your facilitator for the fourth and last of the community conversations, community investment conversations that have been put on by your commissioners, your Board of Commissioners of Washington County, for the benefit of all the residents in the county. The purpose of today is basically to take you all through the budget, budget 101, if you will, the budget process, to introduce you to the budget for 2021 as developed by staff in consultation with commissioners, and to give as much of your feedback and participation and ideas about the budget as you can to your 5 sitting commissioners, or to the commissioners who have joined us today, and to let them know what you as county residents think. But before we go forward, I would like to invite Fernanda Willand to let our Spanish-speaking attendees know about the Spanish channel and help them to get into there if they so desire. Fernanda?
Buenos días y a todos y bienvenidos a esta conversación. Queremos recordarles que hay interpretación en español disponible esta mañana y lo único que hay que hacer es buscar en la parte inferior derecha de la pantalla una imagen de un globo terráqueo. O si usted está usando el teléfono, el símbolo de puntos suspensivos de 3 puntos. Haga clic en cualquiera de estos dos y seleccione español. También tendrá la opción de silenciar al hablante de inglés y luego podrá escuchar la interpretación en español durante el resto de la reunión. Si en algún momento desea hacer una pregunta o un comentario, puede hacerlo y un intérprete repetirá su pregunta en inglés para que todos los demás lo escuchen. Thank you, Marcus.
Gracias, Fernanda. Yeah, as I said, these conversations are meant and designed to introduce the 620,000, or so I'm told, county residents to the budget process. But before we get going, I want to do a couple of quick logistics and maybe let you know about the run of show. At the beginning, you saw the basic timeframes, but you're going to hear from your chair of the board. You're going to hear from your District 1 Commissioner, Dick Scouten. You're going to hear from your Chief Financial Officer for the county, Jack Leong, who will take you through the budget process, this year's budget, and provide some Q&A, some questions and answers. And then the second half of this morning's program, you're going to hear about the budget, how it compares to your household budget. We're going to do some polling. We're going to share those results, and hopefully along the way, and particularly at the second part of this session, of these sessions, we're going to have some robust discussion with you, the members of the county, about what you want, what you see as priorities, and the feedback you want to give to your commissioners. Now, before we get into it, I'm just going to run through a few quick slides to kind of set the tone for the morning. And if you would, maybe the first slide, Kevin. Oh, and before I get into the slides, and I actually do see a raised hand, I would encourage everybody to ask questions along the way. There is a raise hand function at the bottom of your screens where you can raise your hand. There is also a question and answer section that if you hit Q&A at the bottom of your screen, you can type in questions that you have along the way, either about the budget presentation itself, either about about the polling, or anything else you want to ask your commissioners with respect to the development of the 2020-2021 budget. So please keep that in mind. Keep your questions coming, and we will address the raised hands when we get to that section. But for now, I'm just going to run through these slides quickly, and then we'll pull up a few names. But the first thing is, we can go past this slide. This is the last session of 4 that we've had to discuss these budget issues, and they've been well attended, and the questions have been fast and furious, but all with the benefit of the county in mind. So I hope today is the 4th such session. Kevin, next slide, please. Rules of engagement, guidelines. As you can tell, you can email your comments along the way, but that's also for the future too. You can email your questions about budget or anything related to the county to the clerk above. But today's conversation is going to be important. It's only 2 hours, so it's important that you stay engaged. We know this technology is hard to stay attentive, but please listen to understand. Please speak your truth responsibly. By that, we mean hopefully we'll keep it civil. We just want ideas. We don't want vitriol. We don't want fights. We just want well thought out positions shared with the commissioners. Express your values without diminishing others. Everybody has an opinion. It doesn't matter if yours is pro or against. Just share it without detracting from someone else's. And then we know that talking about money isn't easy. But so expect to be uncomfortable during this conversation, but that just means we're making progress. The final thing is just accept non-closure. This is only one step of the process. And as your commissioners and your CFO along the way will share with you, there are a lot of ways to engage with Washington County. Next slide, please. The first part of the program will be a Budget 101, as I mentioned, and you'll hear directly from the Chief Financial Officer of the county, Jack Leong. He'll take you through interminable details about the budget, but he'll also let you know how you can plug in along the way. During the discussion, I'll try to make sure that your questions and comments, you get to make them. Now, because we want to hear from as many residents as possible, I'm just going to remind you that like a regular board meeting, we're going to have 2 minutes to speak, and hopefully that will be enough time for us to hear from the community. And the commissioners may ask you follow-up questions, staff may ask you follow-up questions. And one other thing I'll say before we go to the next slide is that if there are any questions along the way that staff or your commissioners cannot answer, they will work on those questions later and then post them on the county website. And they will also give you a couple of places where that will be once the session is over. Next slide, please. The purpose of today, we've talked about it a couple times, but share information about the budget, provide an opportunity for the community to weigh in about what they think the priority should be, and advance the county's ongoing effort to center community need as you help them develop short and long range budgets for the county. Next slide, please. Another thing that this conversation is today, it's a chance for you to understand a very complex budgeting process. Mr. Leong will share with you special fund restrictions, the requirements the county has to balance its budget, and a lot of the unfunded mandates that come out because of emergencies or life or community requests. So he'll address all of that. But your county commissioners believe that the first step in a long-term strategy to better center community needs in the budgeting process is what's happening today. And it's a chance for us as community members to work through an exercise with your commissioners so they can get a feel for what your priorities are. Next slide, please. We've talked about this, hopefully I've given you an overview of what you're going to hear, and you will hear more details from your CFO. There will be chances for feedback, but the goal of today is to center community needs in budget planning, notwithstanding all the constraints that the county budget presents. Next slide, please. Now, some of you today may be in attendance expecting a participatory budgeting process. That is not what this is. We are listening to community. The commissioners want to hear from community, but participatory budgeting is when a community comes together to jointly decide how to allocate a public budget. The community investment conversation is where your board of commissioners is going to hear from you as they develop the short and long-term investment priorities. Right now, the responsibility still rests with your commissioners to develop and decide the budget. But for them to do that well, they have to hear from you. So while we are not at participatory budgeting today, and the county does not have that structure today, they do want your input to influence their decisions. Next slide. And lastly, I mentioned it, but there's a way to get involved and share your thoughts. You'll hear this a few times throughout the program. You can reach out with finance questions directly to the CFO. Any questions directly to the Washington County Clerk, Mr. Moss, who is on this call today. And you can contact your Board of Commissioners directly at these email addresses. But it's key that if you want to change your county, you reach out to your county staff and commissioners directly. Next slide. Oh, and before we get to this point, the only other thing I'll close with before I introduce you to the chair of the Washington County Commission is that we told you where the Q&A is. We told you how to raise your hand, but I would encourage everybody on this call who has some opinion or comment or question or knowledge to impart to the commissioners to please be brave. It is uncomfortable frequently to speak in a public forum, but your commissioners want to hear from you. So please try to fight through that and share your thoughts with your commissioners. And with that, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce the chair of the Board of Commissioners for Washington County, Chair Catherine Harrington. Chair Harrington.
Good morning, Mr. Mundy, and to everyone who's joined us today. Thank you for joining us here. I really appreciate it for our fourth installment of this community investment conversation. I'm pleased to be joined today by Commissioner Dick Schouten, our host of today's event, as well as Commissioner Pam Treese. Gaining community input is early in the budget process for the next proposed budget year is relatively new to us here in Washington County. In fact, this is just the second time in 2 years. Last year, we were able to do this in person. So there was more of an intimate conversational feel. You know, we broke up at tables, for example. And this is all part of our working on transparency. Transparency is very important to me in my public service. And I'm pleased that my colleagues on the commission are as interested in transparency in government as I am. This year, we're embracing new techniques to continue our learning process. I'm really thrilled that you're here today and that together, we as board members and you as members of our community, as well as the great staff we have here in the full agency, are working together to learn more, to hear more about this, and to try to get better to fulfill your needs here in our community. Hey. I do want to let you know that we do have a participant guide. We had worked hard to get this participant guide developed in advance of this series. Unfortunately, something about the distribution logistics did not work out. So just recently, I've been assured that it was emailed to everyone who's participating here, but I can also tell you that it is available right on the Washington County website. If you go to co.washington.or.us, that's the Washington County website, and search community investment, you'll get a link to a web page, and on that web page will be a little blue hyperlink to take you to the participant guide. I've also been assured that the link to it will be posted in the Q&A session as well. But for those of you who are participating via YouTube today, I wanted to make sure I articulated directions to that web page. Now, at this point, this is a community investment conversation, and I want to turn the mic over to my colleague, Commissioner Dick Schouten, so that you have the opportunity to hear about his budget priorities. Thank you, and once again, welcome for being here.
Thank you for that introduction, Chair Harrington. Just to open up, I do compliment you on your leadership with respect to budget outreach. we really didn't do enough of that. In fact, we did very little of that until the last couple of years. And I think the opportunity to go out to the community and talk about the budget, explain it, and get input is something that has been overdue, frankly. So thank you. As far as my priorities, I've become increasingly more concerned in the last year or 2 or 3, and maybe frankly even earlier than that, with respect to the county's priorities and funding in the area of health and human services and issues that touch and concern social determinants of health. And then, of course, the public health crisis that we face has really made stark our needs and the community's need to be ready for a major outbreak of some kind, disease, and so forth. So I would like to see if we can find a few places elsewhere in the budget where we can try to find additional money for mental health funding, for early education, to partner up with some of our nonprofit agencies to push programs that further sort of early intervention, early work done for children and families, which I think in the long run will be very cost effective. I thought a bit about where that money could come from. Well, obviously we look to the state and the federal government for additional help, and as far as I know, we're going to have a new federal administration, and we might have some opportunities there. But inside our own budget, I have often, in recent times, been thinking about the general fund component of our transportation, land use of transportation, the very specifically transportation component. Years ago, we did have voter-approved major street transportation improvement program levies and bonds that paid for additional capital projects and so forth for our transportation. That's been a long time ago since the voters approved that, and we have always very consistently, as a matter of policy, sort of pretended that bond was still in place, and with a bit of an inflation factor, we would continue to take a chunk of our general funds, as if that bond was still, if those transportation bonds were still in place, the major street transportation improvement program. I would maybe suggest possibly that we trim a little bit of that off and direct, perhaps maybe push off a couple of road projects or a couple of transportation pieces so that we can find some additional money on the public health and on the social determinants of services inside our health and human services area and mental health programs. On the sheriff's side, I would suggest that we work closely with the sheriff and with our public to see what we can do to trim back some of the sort of classical code enforcement, well, I shouldn't say code enforcement, but law enforcement activities, and see if we can find some additional dollars there, again, to look towards being proactive in terms of again, the social determinants of health kind of issues, the opportunities to get young families off to a better start, things that we might be able to do to reduce crime in the long run. So those are a couple of thoughts that I have. I also want to be very much humble, and I'm very much aware that my time on the board is limited to the last couple of months, now not even a couple of months. But these are a few of my thoughts that I might suggest that we tweak our general funding for transportation to direct it towards some of the areas of social services. And with that, I will be looking forward to seeing the transition soon to our new County Commissioner-elect, Nafisa Faye. That's what I have for the moment.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Schouten, and for everybody, it's you've heard a couple of ideas from your commissioners, and now we're going to hop right into the program, but I do see there are a couple of raised hands. We are going to have, I would ask you to hold your questions, but we are going to have some interaction both in the budget section and in the later section. Oh, and I see a hand from Chair Harrington as well.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Mundy.
Yes.
At this point, we need a little bit of help from someone in our audience. Because of the logistics and our familiarity with this technology, we need someone to just ask in the Q&A for the link to the participant guide so that we can reply with that link. Sorry for the interruption.
No worries, no worries. So we will do that. I am sure staff heard that request and staff will be working on that. And in the meantime, I'm looking out of my window here. It's overcast and slightly gloomy, but I can think of no one that will bring sunshine to you and enlightenment and illumination more than your CFO, Jack Leong, to take us through some budget basics. So Jack, if you would, please brighten our day.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for today's community investment conversation. As Marcus introduced, my name is Jack Leong. I am your county CFO at Washington County. And today, my goal is to provide you a very high-level overview of our county's budget, both from a structural perspective and from a detailed number perspective. Again, we have very limited time, so I realize that we can only stay at a fairly high level, but please be sure that I'm always available to answer questions and have further discussions with any of you on the county's budget. With that, we'll move on to the next slide, please. And so this is basically a quick structure of what we're going to go over today. We are going to start with our budget guidance, is what guides the county's budget development process. And then we'll move on to the structure of the budget, specifically the types of funds that the county has. And then we'll go into the operational area, that is a reflection of the county's operations, as well as what the budget actually supports. And then we'll talk about how the budget is developed from a time perspective, from a chronological perspective, what that process looks like. Last but not least, we will look at the fiscal year 2021 budget and then do an overview over there so we can get a little bit of flavor of what the dollar amount looks like and what the percentage looks like. Before we dive into all of that, I wanted to reiterate Washington County's mission. Our mission is to provide excellent and cost-effective services that support healthy, peaceful, safe, and sustainable communities, and encourage meaningful participation in community activities and county governance. Next slide, please. So let's start with the guidance. The county's budget, like any other local jurisdictions in Oregon, is governed by the Oregon budget law, specifically the Oregon Revised Statute 294.305 through 294.565. And in addition to that, the county also has set charters and code that documents the county's decision on the county's budget structure, on the county's budget process. And then last but not least, there's also the Board of County Commissioners' directions on priorities, both from a short-term basis and a long-term basis that guides our budget development within the county. And these directions and priorities are always developed by the county commissioners with considerations of the community need in mind, with that's all derived from all the community engagement opportunities that the county commissioners has to collect comments and inputs and considerations from the community members like yourself. Next, let's talk a little bit about the budget structure. We have the funds as a basic structure for the budget. It's also defined in ORS. And then you can consider the funds like the checkbooks or checking accounts that we have in a household. They're like a separate accounts for dedicated efforts. A fund is a legal segregation of the county's resources and expenditures, and any transfer among funds that is done after the budget process will have to go through the same public process to facilitate. And then currently the county, for operation like the county, for the normal household, maybe we have one or a few accounts to track our general spending, track our maybe savings for mortgage or saving for auto loan, and that's kind of those ideas. And for the county, our operation is a little more complicated. We have 81 funds in total. And these funds can be categorized as a general fund or special funds. Next slide, please. So to go into a little more information about general fund versus special fund, general fund is pretty much a catch-all fund that has all of the county's discretionary resources and discretionary expenditures within. And we do have traditionally programs and operations that's primarily supported by general fund, and that is a huge part of general fund resources and spending every year. And then move on to special funds. They're used to segregate very dedicated resources and very dedicated expenditures to a very special purpose. These dedications could be mandated by a grant that we receive, could be mandated by a special fee that we assess, could be mandated by a special levy that the voter has approved, where the county has clear guidance on how to use these funds and how to spend these funds. So the county has one general fund that is essentially our general spending area, and then 80 special funds altogether for this year. Next slide, please. Now let's talk a little bit about the county's functional area, aka operational area. This is where the county's budget or the county structure turns into day-to-day services in the community. From left to right, we have the general government. That's your assessment, taxation, county auditors, county council. Then we have the public safety and justice. That's the whole public safety and justice functional area. And then we have land use and transportation. And then we have housing, health, and human services. And then last but not least, we have the culture, education, and recreation. That's the 5 operating functional areas within the county that represents the county's service delivery and operations. Next slide, please. In addition to the operating functional areas, the county also have non-operating functional areas. These are the capital spendings, including transportation, facilities, and information technology. And then we have the non-operating functional areas like insurance, debt service. Those are non-operating category. And then we have non-departmental. Non-departmental is a very small portion of the county's budget. It primarily represents the county's contingency fund. Next slide, please. Now we have talked about the structure. Let's talk a little bit about how the county's budget is developed from a time and action perspective. So it's truly a year-round process. For this year's budget, or I should say for next year's budget, county budget fiscal year 2021-22, we actually start the process in July of 2020. That is where our preparation starts, our planning starts, where we build a project plan, where we actually assign specific due dates for specific actions, where we work with the departments to kind of lay out the foundations. And that happens between July to September, the first fiscal quarter of the year. And by the way, the county's fiscal year starts on, excuse me, the county's fiscal year starts on July 1st and then ends on June 30th. Then moving on to the second fiscal quarter, from October to December, that is a time for priority setting. That is actually where the county commissioners work with the county administrative office, and the administrative office work with every department within the county to develop our budget priorities, our operational priorities for the next fiscal year. And this is a primary reason why we're doing this community investment conversations right now, and then have ongoing communications with the community about the county's priority, about where the community needs are. So please take this opportunity and any other opportunities to provide your input and your point of view to the county commissioners or the county administrative office. And then that we also start the budget development process begins. That's where we kind of lay out the foundations and get our softwares all ready for next year, and then really get the work starts. From January to March of 2021, that is really the time where we get our work together to start working with the numbers, working with the priorities, working on budget narratives. That is where the department actually stays very busy, looking at their operational plan for next year, ensuring that they're delivering service in the most efficient perspective, in the most efficient manner possible. And that is actually during the time where my team worked directly with the departments to get all of the department's budget developed and together. And then moving on into April 2021.
Y después nos movemos a abril del
April
año 2021.
That is where we actually assemble the budget together. As you know,
organizamos el presupuesto.
81 funds. And then all of these funds
recuerda que tenemos 81
fondos the county's total budget.
Y entonces ahí es donde se desarrolla el
That is where my team actually collect all of the information, put it together in the same structure, and then assemble a book that's called the county's budget summary. And it includes both the number perspective of where the counties are planning to spend the money, as well as the story and the budget narrative that goes with the numbers that explains how this changes are made and how the budget turns into service deliveries in the community. And then we also schedule the public budget meetings during that time and have those announced. And moving on into May, that's where the public meetings starting to happen. That's where the budget committee actually come together, and the budget committee meets 2 times. The budget committee's first meeting is for the county administrative officer to provide the county's budget to the budget committee, and then provide a very detailed staff report to every functional area, every org unit of the county's budget, and then answer any questions that the budget committee has. And then later on in that month, toward the end of May, that's where we schedule a public hearing for the county's budget, hosted by the budget committee. And that is where the public can come in and provide testimonies or input to the budget committee. To the budget committee on the county's budget.
Al comité y
so
el
that is
presupuesto.
Definitely a public involvement opportunity in there as well. And moving on into June, when the budget committee accept the county's budget, approves the county's budget, and then they provide it to the Board of Commissioners for adoption. And this next year, we have a target date of June 15th for the county's budget adoption by the Board of Commissioners. Now, I have highlighted a few community involvement opportunities. One is right now in this community investment conversations. Another one is in May during the public testimony time for the budget committee. I want to assure you that those are only the public opportunities for public to engage. As a community member, you can engage with the Board of Commissioners, engage with the County Administrative Office, or come to me or my office for any questions or comments about the county's budget any time of the year. It's the community engagement process is a year-round process at Washington County. Next slide, please. So we have covered a lot of information in a short amount of time. Hopefully that you have all been paying attention to the information I'm presenting, and then hopefully you're ready for some polling questions. And I will ask Mr. Moss to help us tee up the polling questions. All right, we have 2 questions that covers for the information that I have just presented. The first question is, when month does the county adopt a budget for the next fiscal year? And then simultaneously, there is a second question, is when can the public provide input to the county's finances and budget? So please use the polling feature that's on your screen, and then select the best answer for both of these questions. And we'll give it a minute for the votes to come in. All right, how are we doing with the voting? Oh, I just see the polling result came in, and it looks like you guys are doing great. Thank you very much. And the first question, what month does the county adopt budget for the next fiscal year? And most of you selected June, and that is correct. In fact, this year that we're targeting June 15th as a target adoption date for the county's budget. And we do it in June just so we can get the budget together and then ready in time for the New Year's operation starting July 1st of the new fiscal year. And then for the second question, most of you have definitely heard my message about providing input to the county's finances and budget is a year-round process. Please take any opportunity that you have to engage with the Board of Commissioners, with the County Administrative Office, with my office about your thoughts and perspectives on the county's finances and budget. Thank you very much, Mr. Moss. And we move on to the second portion of this presentation. Next slide, please. So now we're going to dive into a little bit more detail of the county's budget in numbers. We'll look at the fiscal year 2020-2021 budget as an example. Next slide, please. So within the county's budget document, the budget summary, every year there's a budget message that really highlights this year's budget priorities within the county's budget. And that budget message is drafted by the county administrator. And that county administrator actually provides a lot of good information about the thought process, about the priorities, about the directions that we're getting into the budget, obviously based on the Board of Commissioners' priority settings. So for the fiscal year 2020-2021 budget, there are three general areas of priorities. The first area is continuity of services. And keep in mind, when we were developing this set of budget, we were back in February, March, April time of 2020. That is when the COVID-19 pandemic is just starting. We have a lot of unknowns and uncertainties. At the same time, the economy is starting to suffer from the pandemic as well. So we're dealing with a lot of uncertainties of continuity of service at the time. And then the county actually established as one of the priorities is one, that we're responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and keeping the public's health as a top priority, and then maintain the county's services during the pandemic is also a priority. The second area that was mentioned in the budget message is also caution, is protecting the ongoing support for vital services. We knew that responding to this pandemic is going to be a lengthy process. We knew that it's not going to go away in a month or a short amount of time. And that's why we're looking out into the future to ensure that we are not compromising any vital services to support out of the county's operations. And then at the same time, we did not forget about the pre-pandemic priorities that the county has set. And those are in 4 categories. They're reflecting in diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're reflecting in economic development. And then affordable housing is definitely a huge priority at the county, as well as transportation is a priority that's reflected in the fiscal year 2020 and 2021 budget. Next slide, please. So starting by looking at the total budget or total spend, the county's total budget is about $1.5 billion, 1.48 to be exact. And then in the table above, you can see that we have laid out comparisons between the fiscal year 2019-20 and the 2020-21. That is separated between general fund and special fund. The general fund portion of that is about $320 million, and then the special fund portion is about $1.16 billion of that. And I have provided a couple of charts that give you a quick breakdown of how did that revenue and expenditures break down into different areas. So starting from the left-hand pie chart, that illustrates the revenue breakdown. You can see that on the revenue side, we have our taxes at 15%. That's a large portion. Intergovernmental, which is all the federal assistance or the state grant that comes into the county to support operations here at the local level. That's at 19%. And then we have charges for services at 10%, operating transfer in at 14%. The smaller portions are the fines and forfeitures, interdepartmental, miscellaneous, and then licenses and permits. And there is also a large portion of beginning fund balance that gets carried over from the last fiscal year, and that actually helps cash flow the county for the first couple of months before some of this other revenues comes in. It's a part of the county's revolving business practice. And then moving on to the middle chart, that is where the county's expenditures gets break down into different functional areas, as mentioned before. You can see our general government is at 13%, public safety and justice at 15%, land use and transportation at 9%, housing, health, and human services at 17%, culture, education, and recreation at 4%. Obviously, capital is a large spending at 21%. Non-operating is also a large portion at 21% as well. Non-departmental at less than 1%. And then the general fund and special fund percentage breakdown is general fund is about 22% of the county's budget, and special funds combined are at 78% of the county's budget. Next slide, please. This is the similar information that was provided on the last slide, and it gives you a number breakdown for all of the functional areas in terms of dollar amount as well as percentage. Next slide, please. So let's focus in on general fund a little bit. What does the general fund's revenue expenditure looks like, especially that is the discretionary resources and expenditures for the county. So starting on the revenue side, we have our taxes, obviously at the largest portion at 38%. And then the MISTIP and the WCCLS, standing for Major Street Transportation Improvement Program, and Washington County Cooperative Library Services, those two sources combined at 21%. And then we have the interfund and transfers at 23% and departmental revenues at 18%. Excuse me. And then moving on to the expenditure side, how does the expenditure breaks down? We have our general government at 23% of general fund, public safety and justice at 31% of general fund, land use and transportation at 1%, housing, health, and human services at 11%, culture, education, and recreation at 1%, non-departmental at 1%, and then non-operating at 32%. So a natural question that will come to mind to say, when we look at general funds expenditure, there seems to be a huge difference between among some of these functional areas, and what is the reason of these differences? That is part of the traditional general fund, special fund financed operations breakdown. So traditionally, the general government, the public safety and justice, and a good portion of, but not entirety of housing, health, and human services are traditionally supported by general fund. And then land use and transportation, culture, education, recreation are traditionally supported by special funds. That's why you're not seeing a large portion of those areas in the general fund mix. That's why when you look at the total budget breakdown, the difference between the operational areas are not that great. And then when you look at general fund, there's actually a large differences in terms of the percentage mix between them. Next slide, please. So let's dive into each one of these operating functional areas and take a look at how we actually spent the county's budget in these areas, starting with the general government. This is a rather unique budget year for the county because we have received a large portion of the federal assistance to the COVID-19 CARES response in CARES Act. So that is actually segregated out by the county just so we can track the revenues and the expenditures that we are dedicating toward that effort. That fund by itself is 56% of the entire general government. And then the direct services includes the Board of Commissioners, Admin Office, County Council, County Auditors, elections, assessment, taxation, equity, inclusion, community engagement. Those are combined into a category called direct services. That's at $26 million or 14% of the general government. And then support services is your back office functions like finance, human resources, IT, facilities. Those areas constitute 30% of the general government or $56.5 million in total. So together, the general government's total budget is $187 million. And then we also have a general fund, special fund breakdown between those $74 million in general fund, $113 million in special funds. Next slide, please. And then moving on to the public safety and justice operating area, we have the local option levy that's in there, the community corrections, that DA's office, the juvenile justice court and law library, and sheriff's office. The total budget within that category is $216.6 million. You can see the percentage breakdown on the pie chart on the left-hand side, and you can see the general fund, special fund breakdown in numbers on the right-hand side, the bottom right table. The general fund portion of this portion is $99.9 million, and the special fund portion of this table is $117 million, roughly. The total budget for this category is $216.6 million. Next slide, please. Next, we move on to the land use and transportation. This is where roads gets built, building permits gets issued, construction plans gets reviewed. And this is where we break them down roughly in building services, current planning, engineering services, long-range planning, other, and the road fund. You can see that the road fund is by far the largest portion in this category. The total budget in this area is $130.7 million in total, with $4.4 million in general fund and $126 million in special funds. Next slide, please. The housing, health, and human services functional area That's where our aging and veteran services, animal services, community development, HHS, which stands for Health and Human Services Admin, housing, human services, and public health. That all belongs to this category. The total budget for this category is $251.3 million. And the larger portion, obviously, is human services at 40%, housing services at 41%, followed by public health at 10%. The general fund portion of this budget is $34.9 million, and the special fund portion is $216 million. Next slide, please. And then we move on to the cultural education and recreation. So this is where we have our agricultural, we have the fair complex, libraries, parks, and transient and lodging tax. The total budget for this portion is $64.8 million. And then obviously the largest portion in this area is the libraries. And a good part of that revenue is coming from the previously mentioned Washington County Cooperative Library Services. This stands at 79% of the cultural education and recreation. The general fund portion of this functional area is $2.3 million, and the special fund portion is $62.4 million, with a total budget of $64.8 million. Next slide, please. So this slide, I combine all the non-operating functional areas. We have the capital, we have the non-departmental and non-operating functional areas in this area. You can see the capital is broken down into facilities, information technology, and transportation, and the non-operating and the non-departmental. Obviously, the larger portion of this is the non-operating section, where we have the 51% of the county's budget, and then of this category's budget, excuse me, and then we have the transportation capital at 39%. And then the general fund portion of this 93% is $93 million, and then the special fund portion of this is $539 million, with a total budget of $632 million. Next slide, please. And then obviously we covered a lot of high-level information in a short amount of time. Due to the time constraint, we're not able to provide a whole lot of more detail. There's actually a lot of more details in the county's budget, a lot more narratives and story that's available to you. I wanted to present to you some additional information that's on the county's website. Next slide, please. So on the county's website homepage, we have a left-hand side navigation panel, and that illustrates the county's key services and informations. One of the items in there alphabetically is the county's financial information, and there is a link that's provided at the bottom of the screen as well. The financial information includes the budget summary book that I have provided to you, includes the county's financial reporting that provides your information about after we build a budget, how do we actually execute and operationalize that budget and turn that into services in an actual perspective. And then has the county's cost plan, the county's fee schedules, and then all kinds of financial information that's available to the public from the county. Next slide, please. So in addition to the published information, we also have a very interactive budget dashboard that was developed in the last 2 years. And then this budget dashboard actually provides a lot of data points, a lot of data breakdown for the county's budget. You can go deeper from the functional areas into the departments, into the organizational units, into even each programs and the account numbers to see how the county actually utilized the budget and turn that into community services. For anyone that find that budget dashboard useful, I highly encourage you to check out the county's budget dashboard and then drill down into those data and get more information from the county's dashboard. Next slide, please. So that is the end of my presentation. Obviously, I like to continue to reiterate, this is a lot of high-level information in a very short amount of time. I want to let you know that we'll open up a Q&A session for this part of the presentation, but also I'm available to your questions or comments anytime after this session as well. Please feel free to reach out to me after. With that, I will pass it back to Marcus and then help us facilitate a Q&A session for the portion that I just presented about the county's budget structure and the county's budget for fiscal year 2021.
Very well, Jack, and thank you. I was right. It was illuminating and it did brighten our day, so I appreciate that. I will ask Clerk Moss right now. I see that participants have their hands raised, so let's start off with there, and then I'll put Latricia Tillman on deck for some of the questions. I think there's been very active Q&A, so I wanted to make sure we heard some of those as well. But Kevin Moss. Kevin?
All right. Thank you very much, Marcus. I will start with David with his first hand up for a quick question.
Thank you.
All right. David, can you hear us? David, you were muted there. All right, can't hear David, so we'll move to the next one of Bing. Bing, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I saw the budget. There's a portion about diversity, equity, inclusion. I know a lot of city that's only means for racial diversity. They focus on that. I just wondering, for the county, that part of portion, did they consider physical and mental disability at that part of diversity inclusion? What's the portion of those in the past?
Thank you very much for your question, Bing. From the budget perspective, I can tell you that it's absolutely not the county's intention to only focus on racial equity in this office. And we are actually very fortunate to have our Chief Equity Inclusion Officer, Latricia Tillman, on the call today. I wanted to see if Latricia has a comment about program priorities regarding this question.
Sure, thank you, Jack. Thank you for your question. We will be focusing on both inequities related to race, ethnicity, language, national origin, as well as other elements of diversity, such as disability, LGBTQ status, and other factors. Our initial focus is on protecting civil rights of clients and employees. And as you are aware, that encompasses all of those different elements of diversity. And the county has made a very strong commitment to lead with race. And so as we lead with looking at racial inequities, we will be also considering other elements of diversity and really considering the impact of intersectionality, which is when those different elements create additional burdens in certain communities. So that's where we'll be focusing and really wanting to create a more inclusive environment, both within the county workforce as well as within the Washington County community at large.
Thank you. Thank you. Kevin, we had a few more hands.
Yes, we do, Marcus. The next one up is Cal. Cal, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm in the middle. I have a couple of questions. The first one is specific to what Dick had mentioned as well, that the funding cut for the sheriff's office. The reason why I'm bringing this up, I'm really concerned with the fact that the uprising, civil unrest, and all that stuff that happened in the past, 4 years, and today now it's actually gotten worse. And I can't imagine anytime soon this is gonna be, since we are so divided as a nation, anytime soon, even in the county, that this is gonna get any better. So it's very important for me. I have children, and I'm a big supporter of the sheriff's office, the work they do. How much money, or is it necessary to cut the funding for the sheriff's office? Because that's an entity that actually that we need.
I don't know. Jack, would you like to begin response or pass it?
Well, thank you, Cole. I just your point is well taken. I feel that this may actually be a better question and discussion point for the later portion of this community investment session, because we do have time scheduled to discuss more about programmatic and the future investment priorities. I can tell you that from a county's 2021 budget perspective, our priorities is staying true to what was illustrated in the budget message, is that continuity of services, responding to the public health and public safety concerns during the pandemic is definitely continue, and especially keeping those vital services going has been reflected in the budget.
Yeah, and Cal, Jack is right. That is a good question, but it does better fit later in the program after we've kind of looked at the functional areas for the county and kind of a greater scale. But we're not going to let us table that question, but we're not going to forget that question, if that's all right with you. All right, Kevin, the next raised hand, and we will remember to come back to Cal's question.
Yes, thank you, Marcus. The next one is Mike. Mike, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
First of all, thanks, Jack, for a very clear presentation. Really excellent. Well done. Kind of a two-part question. The first of which is the levy that was passed in May for public safety. Is that considered a special fund, and can that be changed or modified at all by county commissioners, or is that as is?
Thank you very much. That is a very excellent question. So if you recall the public safety and justice slide that we presented, there is actually a general fund and special fund split. And I can tell you that a very good portion of that special fund split is this public safety levy that you are bringing up. It's very much so a special fund to help supplement the county's public safety and justice budget. There's you're tempting me to provide a little more information about the county's tax rate and our general fund mix. Is when you look at Washington County, our tax rate is actually not ranked very high compared to our peers within the state. Our tax rate is actually ranked number 21 out of 36 counties in the state. What that means is our general fund by itself is oftentimes not able to provide all the services, all the resources that's needed in the general government, the public safety areas, and that is why the levy is a huge part of the operation of the public safety and justice functional area.
Okay, I didn't hear an answer to the part about can the commissioners change that, or does it just remain as is?
My apologies. Yes, so the levy, when the levy goes out, it goes out in the form of a promise to the voter. We actually have very detailed programming of what this levy is going to be used by the county in terms of supporting the service, and that is part of the county's accountability and transparency to the community and the voters that that helps the county make a decision on the levy. So there's I want to say that at a very, very granular level, there may be some discretions on programming, and that's usually not to the level that the county commissioners programs. But at a higher level, in terms of what directions, what programs, what areas we're spending that, there's actually little discretion on shifting those dollars. I want to see if any commissioners have a comment regarding the public safety levy.
Okay, before we do that, though, let me finish my question.
Sure.
The sheriff's office has some front-end services that they're very focused on and actually well known for. I'm specifically talking about their mental health approach, where they team county mental health people with deputies and attempt to, solve things from not necessarily a strict law enforcement perspective, but from a social and mental health perspective. So that's money from, I assume, 2 or 3 possible parts of the county. How do you account for that and measure it and plan for those kind of, combined things?
Thank you very much for your question. And that is actually at a technical level that I may not necessarily be the right expertise to answer that question. And I can tell you that from a budget perspective, we do have a a granular level of org units and then programs that goes down to the program level. And then to your question is how do we pull those information together and then measure like what the public safety or sheriff's office spend in those areas is a question that I may have to follow up after this session.
Okay, I'll look forward to your follow-up.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike. And,
if I may, this is Commissioner Dick Scouten. I wanted to respond at least a little bit to the query about discretion on levies that are passed. I would say very close to zero. I think it's a practical matter, and I think as a legal matter, the voters have spoken, and I think we need to and should follow the map that's laid out by the bond measure or the levy as the voters approved it. So the discretion is practically zero. My comments earlier about the MSTIP, Major Street Transportation Improvement Program levy, that's a levy that's ended a long time ago, and through a series of legislative changes and initiative changes, money that had originally been for transportation in levies and in bonds were rolled into our general fund and have been general funds for well over 20 years now. And so the last time the voters actually made a decision about transportation for those levies is 20 plus years ago. And what I would look to, maybe the board consider taking some piece of that and stretching some projects out. So we do really have some pressing needs. But I think the difference is that these dollars are now general fund dollars. They're not levy money and bond money. That ended 20 plus years ago, and a lot has changed in the last 20 years. I mean, a lot's changed in the last 10 months or year or so.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Scouten. Clerk Moss, we'll take one more raised hand, and then we'll take a couple from the Q&A, and then we'll get on to the second part of the program. And some of these questions that you may have for Jack, specific to the budget process or this year's budget, we may be able to roll them over into the second section once we've gone through that. So Kevin, please.
All right, thank you, Marcus. The last question we'll take is from Fran. Fran, can you hear us?
Yes, this is Fran Warren. I want to thank the board for this transparency. This is fabulous. And I did not submit things in advance because I wanted to better understand what you're presenting first. So I have a few general things, and then I will be sending a longer question answer. People know me pretty well. There are three things I wanted to ask in general, but there are a number of funds which are spread across multiple departments. Is it possible to reflect this stratification, kind of what we call a slice and dice view, and identify maybe the top criteria that was used for that percentage allocation decision? So example, in the case of, well, you can understand for clean air, that affects multiple departments in terms of environmental issues, social issues, health issues, public health, et cetera. Also in the total spent, could you show a 3-year comparison by functional area? Right now you just have the general and the special funds comparison for 2 years, but you don't have those 5 broken out. That would be helpful to see the delta over the last 3 years. The other one that's kind of, I want to put to bed rumors in a way. So this one needs to be identified. Could you identify the sourcing of departmental budgets? Example, you have the federal, state, local taxpayer situation because you've got the different funds, but are there local business associations that contribute to various departments' funding? And is this shown in revenues or some other area? Residents maybe need to understand if there are any potential Washington County staff decision and resourcing conflicts. But there's rumors out that certain departments actually are funded by certain organizations as part of their budget. And we need to put that, we need to put that to bed. If they're not, then that needs to be clarified. Is it all taxpayer dollars or not? Thank you, I really appreciate it. And I'm gonna get to a lot of the specifics, but I've been very impressed, especially with the presentations about the affordable housing work that's been done. There's a lot of really great stuff, and there's more that could be going on. And I'm making some suggestions in my thing about budgeting. Oh, the last one, really important one. If we do plan to reduce our transportation progress, I would ask that we also reduce our development progress commensurate with those mobility restrictions. As a result of the hold on the new number of road arteries created over the years, we find more and more drivers using neighborhood streets. This is causing even more mental stress for those families who are in isolation due to the pandemic. So if you reduce transportation, you need to reduce development.
Thank you, Fran. And Jack?
Sure, I'll quickly respond to the first couple questions. Your first question, Fran, is about how does the county make decisions when we break funds into multiple departments. I guess the classic example is the general fund, right? General fund covers a lot of different departments. But even when it comes to a special fund like the public safety levy, it also breaks down into different departments. And then there's different decisions that's being made in those situations. I would encourage you to follow up with your question after the session, so I can provide you very focused and strategic, very focused and targeted responses for each one of the situations. And the second, you mentioned about a 3-year view rather than a 2-year view of the comparison. Thank you very much for that input. Obviously, we didn't prepare that data for this presentation, but that data is actually available on the county's website. So if you if you go to the no matter if it's our financial information session or the budget dashboard that I have provided, there are actually historical data in there that's available to the public. Obviously, I'm always available to your questions, either by phone or by email. So feel free to reach out to me anytime. And then the third part of your question, I'm sorry, can you remind me the third part?
Jack, I'm going to interrupt you here and just respectfully request that the staff has kind of captured all of this, and we want to hear from as many residents as possible. So with all due deference to Fran, maybe we can move on to the folks who have been waiting in Q&A. We will get your questions answered. And I would just ask everybody, the commissioners want to hear, they have to prioritize budgets. I would ask you all, if you have multiple questions to ask, if you would prioritize one, let us talk about that and then move on so we can hear from as many residents as possible. And that is no disrespect. That is just the commissioners want to hear as many different folks, and all the questions asked will be answered. So if we could grab one of the Q&A questions, Latricia Tillman, because I want us to get to the next part of our program so you can have some polling. And I think some of what were in the multiple questions by Mike and Fran and others will get answered in the next section. So we'll take one Q&A question and then we'll move along, because there will be a discussion portion as well in the second half.
Okay, this is really challenging because there's been a lot of activity in the Q&A section this morning. And so I just want to reassure people who did put their questions in the Q&A that if we don't get to it now, we'll get to it later. There has been a conversation that's continued across these community investment conversations. So I want to elevate that one, and it's specific to a budget clarification question. The conversation has been around shifting funding from public safety to prevention, focusing on social determinants of health. And there's been conversation about state mandates in funding related to public safety. And so there's been a couple questions in the Q&A today around getting clarity around those state mandated funding requirements for public safety. So if you could clarify those, that would be helpful.
Thank you, Latricia. I will try my best to be concise on this answer, because it's a very, just starting from the very high level perspective, is the county's budget structure is made up by a lot of different funding sources. And obviously the property tax in the general fund is one, the fees and license that we collect, but a huge part of the county budget come from the federal assistance, coming from the state assistance. There's actually a lot of services that's provided at the local level, but using the state resources. So the state mandate, I'll just give one example. Just to kind of share a little more clarity, is our community corrections operations. The department that actually helps with the parole and probations, the transition for folks that's transitioning out of custody, to help them get better prepared to go back into the community, and then with our intention and our priorities to help them not re-enter the system in the later part of their life and livelihood, is that a good portion of that is actually funded by state dollars, and then it's the service is actually mandated by state on that services. So that's just one area where we have to take the state funding and then operationalize that in a way that the state funding's intention is to be. So, and that's really where I think it's getting to a core of the public's question is, $1.5 billion, why can't we just program it at the local level however we want? And actually a huge portion of that $1.5 billion, we do not have that discretion at the county. That's where the mandate is. So that's just one example of many. Commissioner Skelton did speak to the voter-approved public safety levy, that the discretion there is basically near zero to reprogram it, because that's what we presented to the public, and the public actually spoke in the way of a vote to approve it. So we can't have the public vote for one set of services and then turn around and provide a different set of services. That is definitely not what we're supposed to do or what we intend to do. So those are just some examples of both the state mandate or the voter approved mandate of how we have to operationalize these resources. This is a very great question. I want to look back to Marcus or any commissioners to see if they want to speak to this as well.
I would interject here that we've had, the team has shared with me that we've had over 50 or 60 questions. So before we move on, I am mindful of time, but before we move on, maybe we can squeeze in a couple more before we begin the next section. So Latricia, any themes continue to rise to the top that you would want to share or ask Jack or the commissioners?
There was another question about how the county reallocates funds when you experience shortfalls in certain areas. And there was a reference to an article in the media about the county operating in the red. And I would like to give you an opportunity, Jack, to clarify that.
Thank you very much, Latricia. And the county does not operate in the red. It's we build a balanced budget every year. I think what may actually cause some confusion is because that the county, we manage our fund balance reserve, because the county's business is to utilize the public resources, provide as much public services as possible. So we actually have a range of the county's general fund reserve that the Board of County Commissioners has approved for us to stay in. So in certain years when we depending on the operation, if our reserve goes a little bit on the higher level, that means we're not really utilizing all the resources. So we actually operationalize and program our programs to have a little more expenditure than the revenue that's going to be collected in the same year. So in a way, it almost looks like we're operating at a loss, but the intention of that is to drive down the fund balance that we're carrying to turn that into community services. And as soon as we get back into that board approved range, we actually change our programming and then limit our growth to bring that back into a more balanced area. So hopefully that helps clear that confusion a little bit. But the county does not operate in the red.
Thank you. Can I ask one more, Marcus?
Yeah, please do. Please.
Okay. Just given that we're operating in a COVID pandemic environment, we did have a number of questions that came in relative to how the county shifted its funding related to COVID. Specifically, did any priorities shift in this current budget year? Will it in the future budget year? And then there was also a specific question about how we're using COVID funding in the jails.
Thank you very much. There is, let me try to tackle the first part of the question first, is how did the county shift our priorities? And as I presented in the presentation, that the continuity of operations, the public health response to the COVID-19 is a huge priority, and that's where we're taking the CARES Act funding from the federal level and then really utilize that to the full extent possible to turn that into community programs. So that's one priority that may not necessarily be a shift, but it's something that's new in this year's budget. So let's talk a little bit more about the shift in the budget. As you can see that the county has 4 pre-pandemic priorities. DEI is definitely one, transportation, affordable housing, economic development. So what the county did, I try to keep it concise, is that we have utilized general fund funding to support a full Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement with 5 FTEs. We have preserved the economic development manager's position within the county's budget. We have kept the affordable housing commitment that goes along with the Metro's affordable housing bond, and then we also have kept the county's commitment toward transportation, specifically with the major street improvement program. And then what the county did is, with all the other programs, we actually has done a 1% budget reduction, just to, going back to the last question, not operating in the red, just so we are better prepared to see the pandemic play out, to see how the economy gets and how our revenue comes in. So that is a county's active financial management that's literally by definition a shift of priorities from one area to another to support the priorities, but also at the same time being very financially responsible for the county's financial future in terms of the continuation of services in our operations. So hopefully that provides an example of what's in this budget in terms of a shift.
Well, thank you for that answer, Jack. And we're going to stop here, but let me remind everybody, Jack is always available. He's the county CFO. You can reach him. And these questions can be asked year-round of Jack, of his team, of your commissioners, through the county clerk. So there's a lot of conduits to get these questions answered. So please remember that, and please stay engaged. And because I want to get to so many of the questions that are still both in the chat and that people are raising their hands for, we're going to go quickly, hopefully not too quickly, but we're going to go quickly through this next section. So we're going to have a couple of very quick polls, and I just wanted to throw up first the reminder slide. I don't think this is a very engaged group, so I don't think I have to remind you that much about the budget or anything of that nature. But Kevin, if you would, slide, I think it was 33, about just some quick reminders before we get going. And what I'm going to frame out for you is that we're going to take a quick poll. You've heard from Jack, you've heard from the commissioners, and you've actually shared some opinions about what you think is the most important thing. I want you to go back to the 5 functional areas that we talked about, and I'm going to ask you as a community, what are the most important things? That's what we're going to be focusing on, but what are the most important things you feel that your county commissioners should be working on? And I'm going to ask you to pick 2, and then I'm going to ask you to get to 1. So, and we can skip the reminder slide, because I don't have to remind this group and go straight to the poll. There we go. So the 5 functional areas that Jack had spoken about, you've heard them: general government, public safety and justice, land use and transportation, housing, health and human services, and culture, education, and recreation. And what I will say is that, what do you think it's most important for us to be focusing on, whether that's adding money, taking money away, reallocating, just the most important from your perspective? And we'll give another 15 or 20 seconds on this poll, but we're getting good participation. And even though we're not quite closed yet, you'll be unsurprised, I think, to learn that the previous 3 sessions, these 2 that seem to be number 1 and number 2 have come up each time as the areas of concern that the members of the community of Washington County, the residents, are most concerned with. So, and the same thing, even though there was a slight edge to housing, health, and human services, public safety and justice is a close second. And so the second part of this poll is simply which one of these two, public safety and justice or housing, health, and human services, if you had to pick one, what would it be using the same criteria? And we'll give it about 5 more seconds, Kevin. All right. So even though there's a 1 vote difference, 49% of you said public safety and justice was the number one. And that could have been those of you that wanted to increase it, decrease it, or leave it the same, but you all said that that was the most important. And so what I want to do now is maybe go back a slide, I think. Not to the poll, but what I want to do now is talk about household budget. I think it was the previous slide, Kevin. Household budget versus the county budget. And again, we've talked about this. Jack has walked you through the government services budget in great detail. These are the 5 functional areas. These are the areas under the 5 functional areas. And all this slide was meant to convey was that the county commission, your board of county commissioners and your county staff have to figure out every year how to chop up the budget in a way that they are required to, but that brings the most value to the county. Same for your household expenses. You have to figure out how you can pay your bills, take care of your families, and chop up your expenses in a way that brings the most value to your family. Now, the county has different pressures and you have different pressures, but we just wanted people to understand that the very decisions that the county is making, you have to make on a personal level. For me, the example I've been giving is that the county's housing number on the one schedule is 103 million. Well, that's less than 10% of the whole county budget, $1.5 billion budget. But for my personal expenses and for many of us in the community who live in Washington County, rent or mortgage eats up more than 10% of our revenues, and we have to spend more than that on housing. Not everybody, but many of us do. And the way you chop up your budget is going to be different than the way the county chops up its budget. But we just wanted to put you in the frame of, even though that's going to be a little different from a personal budget to a governmental budget, the kind of decision points are going to be just as tough. Next slide, please. This slide, it doesn't throw the dollars on here, but it's based on the dollar amounts from Jack's slides. What this does is break out total budgets. So again, you see the 5 functional areas in the colorful budgets: general government, public safety, and so on. And Jack had already spoken of the capital, non-departmental, non-operating, those expenses that are kind of off the table. What your commissioners are looking at are trying to divide up those 5 functional areas and figure out the best use of that. This slide represents the combination of the special funds Jack spoke about and the general fund. It's combined. So instead of saying, oh, the special fund part of the general government is 1% and the other part of the general fund budget is another percentage. This is the total general government, total public safety, total land use and transportation, and so on. And we just thought it would be good when you get to this next polling question that we're going to do, to have this as a frame of reference. You need to know generally where your county is spending their dollars. Next slide, please. And back to the functional areas. We're about to take a poll because I really want you all to help us decide where the discussion goes from here and what you want your commissioners to know. again, I'm speaking about the functional areas. We're talking about general government, public safety, culture, education, housing, health, and human services. But it is important for you as county residents to know that when we're talking about public safety and justice, we're not just talking about the sheriff. Now that is the lion's share, but we're also talking about juvenile justice and corrections and the jails and the district attorney. The same when we're talking about housing and health and human services. It's not just the housing, human services, and public health, which is a big chunk. It's the veterans, it's community development, animal services. So when you're figuring out on our next poll what you add to, what you would tell your commissioners to add and what you would tell them to take away, it's important that you know for every action that you suggest to them, there has to be an equal and opposite reaction. If you increase a budget, you have to decrease a budget because, as Jack shared, the county is required by law to have a balanced budget. So let's just get right into the next poll, if you would, please. And this poll here, it's a 5-question poll that we're hoping you can answer, but you have 5 choices for each one of the functional areas we spoke about. If you think we should significantly increase a budget for a particular area, reflect that. Moderately increase, reflect that, or decrease or no change at all. So please just work your way through the 5 questions and share with your commissioners what you think their budget priority should be for 2021 and also the future, but we're talking about 2021 right now. So we'll give everybody a little time to respond to this poll. And while you are filling out the poll, while the team is going to tabulate the results of this poll and put it on a different schedule, but while they're doing that, we're going to take the time to go back to the discussion. So when this poll is finished, we're going to get back to those who have their hands raised and those who have questions in the Q&A, whether it was questions about Jack's budget process or anything that has come up that you'd like to raise since then. And again, county staff is listening, your commissioners are listening, and many of them will give direct responses to your questions. Maybe give it about 5 or 10 more seconds, Kevin. All right, so you can scroll through the poll if you want, but the team is going to put it together on a different schedule and make some reflections. But in the meantime, I would like to use, because we have about a half an hour left, I want to use most of that time for a rich discussion with county residents and their commission and staff. So I will ask Clerk Moss to begin addressing a few of the raised hands, and then we'll get to the Q&A once again. Clerk Moss.
All right, thank you, Marcus. First up, we have Bing on this section. Bing, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, please go ahead for up to 2 minutes.
I'd like to see county work more with community partners, and there's many issues that community know their people the best. I hope the county reach out more and share some fundings with the community partners. So through them, there's a lot of conflicts, issues. I think sometimes when you work with partner, that shows the people where the county stand. That will be better to let them know and to address the issue.
Thank you very much for your comment. Would any of the commissioners or staff like to respond to that before we move on to the next question?
Chair Harrington, we cannot hear you. I think you're doubly muted.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Bing, for your comment. I really appreciate it. This is an area where I think we as a county can and should do a better job of helping all of us. So we as the commission, as well as you, understand how we do provide a lot of our services through our community-based organizations and partners. So we can do a better job of highlighting that information, sharing it, as well as we hear your point on continuing to do a better job of working with our partners, our community-based partners, in serving the diverse needs here in the county. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Commissioner Scouten. You raised a good point, but certainly for a long time, as part of one of our really fundamental documents from years ago, the county's plan for 2000 and 2020 has always spoken of the need and the use of nonprofits as being really a cornerstone, as a way of augmenting and being an additional arm for the county for services that we don't necessarily directly provide, but look to nonprofits as a way to further augment our work.
Thank you, Commissioner Scouten. Clerk Moss, is there someone else in the queue?
Yes, there is, Marcus. Next up, we have Sandra.
Welcome, Sandra.
Sandra, can you hear us?
Now I can. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead for up to 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. And I want to just emphasize and agree with the previous person who said that community partners is good, working with nonprofits and so on. So I'm really glad to hear that the commission's willing to do that. My concern is, well, I look at a top priority of government is to protect its citizens' persons and rights, to maintain order and the rule of law, which seems to me then that there's a really valuable place for our law enforcement, for the police to do their job properly. I know that there's so much suspicion that's lately fallen on the police that it does seem reasonable that one of the best ways that we can keep police and citizens honest and respectful is through the use of body cams. I think that's somewhat of a discussion that people are having. So I would strongly support that as part of the most important essential services of the government. Thanks for your time. Appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you very much. And excuse me, Clerk Moss, I neglected to ask Fernanda to bring anybody who still might be out here wanting to go into the Spanish channel. I was hoping she could share that and also remind them, hopefully they can see that we have ASL interpretation as well.
Thank you, Marcus. Bienvenidos a todos nuevamente, y este es un anuncio solamente para recordarles que hay interpretación en español disponible para esta conversación. Lo único que hay que hacer es buscar en la parte inferior derecha de la pantalla una imagen del globo terráqueo, o si está usando el teléfono, el símbolo de puntos suspensivos. Son 3 puntos. Hagan clic en cualquiera de estos dos y luego seleccione español. También tendrá la opción de silenciar al hablante de inglés y luego podrá escuchar la interpretación en español durante el resto de la reunión. Si en algún momento desea hacer una pregunta o hacer un comentario, puede hacerlo y un intérprete repetirá su pregunta en inglés para que todos los demás lo puedan escuchar. Okay, thank you.
Gracias. All right, next question, please, Clerk Moss. Thank you. Next hands raised.
Thank you for that. Next up, we have John. John, can you hear us?
And I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead for up to 2 minutes.
Okay, one of the things I see county government, it's got 3 roles to serve, administer, and govern within the community. And since we're talking about the budgets, when we're talking about external grant funding, how much influence do county commissioners play in that in terms of, let's say someone's going out, I'm saying like, let's say militarization of the police force or some other funding. And then also within the functional areas, do departments with elected leaders have any additional influence within their overall functional areas? And once again, thank you so much.
That's a very good question. Would any of the commissioners like to answer that, or is that a staff question? I'm trying to process it myself.
I think it's more of a commissioner question. Go ahead, Commissioner Schouten. You've been here for 20 years.
Yeah, I would say that we've been very fortunate with respect to the sheriffs that we've had good relationships, and we've had some very good sheriffs. I think we have an excellent sheriff right now, and we have good relations with them. Certainly, the relationship between the sheriff and the county commissioners over the years in different counties have been sometimes very conflicted and fraught with problems. We haven't seen that here, but my own view is that I think I've been fairly jealous about maintaining our ability to budget the sheriff's office, but we work closely with the sheriff. But it's an important department. It's an important part of the budget, and the county commissioners, I think, need to be and have been jealous about their powers of budgeting. Sort of like when you think about the Congress. I mean, they start giving up their ability to budget. They really lose a lot of their ability to really effectively legislate, and we're basically local legislators here. But the fact that we have a couple of department heads, notably the sheriff is elected, does create a certain dynamic there. There's no doubt about that. But I think, really have, and I hope that we continue to hold on to our budget prerogative, because that's the one place that we really have control over what goes on. Given that, for example, law enforcement is a very specialized area that involves a lot of expertise and is headed by an elected official.
Yes, this is Chair Harrington. I think Commissioner Schouten summarized it well. Specific to the two questions that you asked, Mr. Kingery, if I pronounced your last name wrong, I apologize. There are some grants that we have a little bit of influence over. For example, if there is a grant that the sheriff wants to go after, but he needs additional funding resources from the general fund, then we do get to control whether or not we make that expenditure. But once we approve the sheriff's budget, he has the control over those expenditures. The sheriff has control over what equipment he funds through his budget. So I've gotten a lot of questions about why the sheriff's department has the extent of protest equipment or more military equipment. This is an area where I'm learning more, and I think has the opportunity for us together with the public get to unpack that budget some more. But there are a lot of grants that the sheriff goes after that we have absolutely no influence on. Similarly with the district attorney, we have pretty much zero influence over the grants that the district attorney goes after. That's another part of the public safety and justice funding. For community corrections, we have far more control. As mentioned earlier, there are some state mandates that we have to pursue with community corrections. Also with Measure 11 sentencing, that does affect us as well. That's determined by the state. So unlike with police departments, where city councils control all the aspects of that budget, a specific example, the city of Beaverton just went through a supplemental budget hearing in the last week or so, and there was a request to fund some protest laser protection. And I know from listening to that meeting that there was a question about, well, how frequently has the Beaverton police been activated for protests? So they have more control over their budget for public safety than we do, very clearly. As we have an independently elected sheriff and an independently elected district attorney, as do all 36 counties in the state for the DA.
Thank you, Chair Harrington. Kevin, we have a couple more hands raised, and if not, we'll get to the Q&A.
Yes, we still have about 6 hands raised, Marcus. So next up will be Chris. Chris, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you for this opportunity. This has been very well presented. I was dreading a discussion of budget, but you presented it very well. And that's actually what my question is about, is messaging. Given the state of polarity and given the fact that we don't know how to talk to each other anymore, just as we've done in the last couple of years with, racism and other things, I think we have to look at terminology. I mean, my best example, when people came up with the idea to fund the police, unless you looked it up, which I did because I didn't understand it, it's very scary. So I think for messaging for the public, we need to, test out and come up with terminology that people can understand a little bit better so they don't overreact. Does that make sense?
I'd like to respond to that, Chris. Thank you very much for bringing that up. In fact, at the last conversation, I brought up the need for common terminology so that we are speaking to the same issues more effectively. So I agree 100%, and that's something that I'm going to be working with the staff to come up with some sort of common terms. The other thing that I'd like to point out at this time is that this conversation that we're having is important. It's part of our transparency. But within Washington County, we've had a long-standing tradition of communication with our communities through a system called our CPOs, or our community participation organizations. So I would also encourage that those of you that are on this call look at how those organizations meet. I will say that during this time of pandemic, we've had a little trouble with some of those CPO structures meeting, but I know within my district we have 2 that are quite active. So I would encourage you to look at the conversations that are going on at that level as well. And I just wanted to put that plug in for the system and for the fact that we have staff that work with those CPOs, and also great community volunteers that have been working in the CPO structure for a very long time. Thank you.
Thank you, commissioners. Victor's hand is raised. Do we need to respond to Victor at all? Victor, do you need us for anything? Victor is one of our interpreters.
So Marcus, we're having a little bit of trouble switching out the interpreter. So we're trying to work on that on the back end.
Okay, I'll leave you all to that and ask you to give us our next resident who wants to speak.
Yes, next we have Jess. Jess, can you hear us? Jess, you are muted there.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this this community investment conversation. It's the first one I've ever been in, and I'm really impressed with how it's going. The reason I'm on the call is because I I see our population changing in many ways, and with the body, the subject of the body-worn cameras with the sheriff's office has really intrigued me, because I think the deputies are facing more challenges. And, you know, 2 examples are the unfortunate situation occurred out at Hague Lake in 2019, excuse me. And then the other one is the situation in Loa where there was a felon, and the felon tried to run over some deputies out there. And with these extreme situations going on, I think the body-worn cameras are becoming more and more important for our law enforcement. I know that there was a budget meeting with the sheriff back in May of 2020, and that it was discussed, but from what I understand, there could be a shortfall for funds to furnish the costs of the body-worn cameras. And so I was hoping that maybe the commissioners would really look at this, because not only is it good for the deputies, but it's also good for the public to have transparency. If there's officers that have misconduct, or there's any situations in question, it could actually save the county a lot of money in possible lawsuits and other hidden costs that come up. And I just think it's a top importance. And the other subject, I know I only have 2 minutes, I don't have time to talk about all this stuff, is the mental health response team. And I think that's becoming more important. We have new challenges that might get in the way of providing specialized care, like, you know, Measure 110 passed this year, which, you know, we're the first state in the country to pass decriminalization for small amounts of heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine. And I think it's going to present more problems. The COVID-19 situation, you know, we need more professional mental health people to ride with deputies to respond to those calls where people are depressed. And also, I think we have more mental illness in our society. And so I think the sheriff's office is facing new demands. And instead of defunding the police, I think we should increase the funding of the police. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jess. Chair Harrington.
Thank you, Mr. Matza, for your comments, particularly around mental health. This is one reason why we, as the Board of Commissioners, have asked to have this community investment conversation, including polling, so that we can hear more from the community about community-based needs. We, as a board, have been asking our staff for more information and more ideas about how we can do some of the very things that you've discussed to increase the availability of mental health services, behavioral health services, and so forth. And we do have some programs underway to do just that, such as looking at a treatment and triage center. Those discussions are ongoing, but we're really trying to figure out how to further enhance our solution suite through the next proposed budget, which you're having direct feedback in today. For body-worn cameras, you mentioned the opportunity for saving money on lawsuits and hidden costs. Those are some of the same reasons why we on the board have been considering investing in body-worn cameras with a proposal over 5 years. That topic we discussed in June. We had a specific listening session series in August, and we just haven't had the time to come back to it yet, but I believe it's slated for an upcoming work session on December 8th or so, which is a public meeting. Hopefully you'll see in the advanced work session packet some information that will be coming to us a week in advance of the meeting. And as always, those work sessions are publicly available via Zoom as well, though we do not take comment from our community during work sessions. Thank you again.
Thank you, Chair.
I would like to add to that, thank you, Chair, that you can provide us written testimony prior to December 8th as well. So please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Treese.
I would just comment just very briefly, Commissioner Scouten, that I think that decision with respect to body cameras might have been made sooner than it has. But thanks to public comment and concern, we have stretched out that decision-making to allow for more community input before we were making a final decision about the body camera funding. So public comment does matter.
That's accurate. Thank you, Commissioner Scouten. That was a long but rich contribution from the community, from the county residents about that. Clerk Moss, you had said there were a few hands raised, and I'm going to try to keep track of when the vote. And we'll take one more question, and then we'll get the results of your survey, and then we'll get back to the discussion. And we're getting near time, but I just want you all to know we probably can go a few minutes over. This is the most amount of questions of the 4 sessions that we've ever gotten. So we want to address as many of the questions as we can and still be respectful of people's time on their weekend. So Kevin, and then we'll pull up the tabulation.
Yes, thank you, Marcus. Next up, we have Rachel. Rachel, please go ahead.
Hi there. I work as a private investigator, and I do a lot of work on criminal cases in Washington County. And I just wanted to speak a little bit to this notion that increased funding for body cameras is going to be helpful to the community. I just wanted to let people know I was in the Washington County Courthouse one day waiting to do some work, and several police officers were out in the hallway, part of the canine unit, and we're talking about body cameras for dogs. And one of them commented that the county had spent thousands of dollars per camera for body cameras for dogs that he said do not work. So when it comes to body cameras, I think there's more detail than just saying all body cameras are a good way to spend money. Another thing I wanted to mention was that we need a lot of help in this county dealing with our homeless and transient population. And I feel like a really good way to address that situation is when these folks are arrested for minor things and they're at the jail. Currently, there's no process or no way to route them into services to get them off the street and once they're in the jail. It would be really great if we could take some money away from the sheriff's office and provide it to some folks who actually do housing work. And the same thing with mental health. We need folks that are trained mental health professionals. We don't want the police to be attempting to do that job because that's not what they're trained to do. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Would one of the commissioners like to respond to that? Chair Harrington.
Thank you. I appreciate all the information that Ms. Lang contributed. I have no information that says that Washington County has funded body-worn cameras for dogs or implemented that. So that is brand new to me. And I think could be new to all of my 2 colleagues who are here tonight. So we'll specifically be looking into that and inquiring about that from the sheriff, along with the other comments that you made. But I did want you to know that that is brand new to me. Not heard that before.
I would agree, Chair, with your comments there. But I also wanted to reflect a minute on the homeless comments that you made. And also in the Q&A, there's been, I think, over 80 questions answered. So and there's been a lot going on there. But one of the themes that I picked out of those Q&A of the questions is, are we working regionally on these issues? There are a couple of questions about where are the efficiencies to work as a region. And I would want to remind people about the Here Together ballot measure that was passed for supportive services for homeless, and also the affordable housing measure that was passed. We are working on the implementation of both of those ballot measures right now, and those are regional issues. We are working as a region under that umbrella. So thank you for your continued thoughts about how to address these issues, but I would encourage you to take a look at what's happening in those two areas with the money that you as residents have approved and are putting forward to address those issues. So thank you for that as well.
Thank you, Commissioner Treese. And the measures that Commissioner Treese was referring to, those were measures that go through our regional government, Metro, where the 3 counties do participate. In addition to those measures, there was a parks bond measure that Washington County, is affected by. And there was a failed measure recently that would have addressed transportation issues, but the county is active regionally on a lot of issues. I will say that as an outsider. So. And an insider, because I live in the county as well. So we're going to take this moment and see if we can throw up the results of the survey you took about where you, as the residents of Washington County, felt that the commissioners should be concentrating their efforts. So yeah, I can see it on my screen. Hopefully you can see it on your screen, where of the 5 functional areas, just some a quick feedback, and you can see some of the comments highlighted on the side. For public safety and justice, the biggest comments had with the reduction of that area, a decrease in those areas. And it was noted that nearly 3 in 5 suggest significant to moderate decreases, and less than 1 in 3 suggested significant to moderate increases. So overall, the people that are on this call and that responded think that that area could use a little decrease, just as they looked at housing, health, and human services, and nearly 8 in 10 suggested significant to moderate increases there. And you can also see significant, 50% increase, moderate to significant increase in culture, education, and recreation as well. 5 in 10 suggests moderate. 1 in 5 suggests, I think I'm reading that wrong. 1 in 5 suggests a moderate to significant decrease. Okay. But on those, you can see, well, public safety, let's decrease it. Housing, health, and human services, let's increase it. So you're giving some guardrails of what you are thinking as residents to the commissioners. But as you saw from those previous breakdowns of the functional areas, the devil is in the details. There are lots of different things that have to be considered when they're looking at these budgets. But this feedback allows your commissioners to begin to make good decisions and to know what their residents are thinking. So I thank everybody for responding to that. And now I may leave that up a minute, but I do want to go back to the questions. As Commissioner Treese noted, we've had over 80 questions in the Q&A, and I'm gonna go back and pull some of those out if we can. And I can't say with a show of hands, but I am gonna try to field just a handful more of the hands raised, and then at least a couple from the hands raised and a couple from the Q&A. And then I'll reassure one more time before we're gone, and you hear Chair Harrington to close us out, that any of the questions you put in Q&A, many of your questions have been answered real time. The ones that staff and the commissioners cannot answer during this session will be answered and will be posted later on. So Kevin, if you would, I know we have several hands raised.
Yes, thank you, Marcus. Next up, Teresa. Teresa, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Hi,
Please go
everyone.
ahead.
Thank you. This is Teresa Payne. I live in Beaverton, and I just wanted to briefly share my thoughts and opinions on some comments that have already been shared. I agree with the comments previously mentioned regarding the renaming, trying to get on the same page of terminology in the reallocation of funds for public safety and justice for, as we see the brackets that this cohort cares deeply about, housing, education, and human services, in addition to culture. And I think that we need to take these comments very seriously. As a person who identifies as a person of color, I just want to say it's not as if this is not Multnomah County. This is Washington County. And it's not as if, people of color are just going to riot on the street every single day for over 200 days. I just want to say that, we are one of the most diverse counties in the state of Oregon, and that we all want public safety. Yes, as we have seen in budgeting, there are many avenues to get to the same path. I think that, as community members, we ourselves need to collaborate and have conversations on what that looks like. As we have heard, there is a lot of disconnect on what that looks like and some mistrust. People want the sheriff's department to be their security, to be their safety net. But as it has also been said, that the sheriff's department and our local police departments show up after a crime has been committed or after an incident has occurred. And that as community members, we are our own advocates. We are our own, public safety and neighborhood watch and community helpers and mentors. And I think that as we continue to get to know our neighbors and as we continue to build community trust and understanding, we can lower that shield that we have, that there is so much power in helping one another. And yes, it is fantastic to rely on government for assistance, but I think that as individuals on this call and people who are listening in on YouTube and people who will probably be listening in later or reading the transcript, that I would challenge each and every person on this call to be a part of the change that they want to see. That our elected leadership is doing everything that they can, but we need to help them help us. And yes, budget for the sheriff's department, once it is given, cannot be dictated, as Chair Harrington has said. So I do not agree with body-worn cameras. They do not make things safer. And I know my 2 minutes is up, so I would like to thank you, Mr. Mundy, for all of your time. I know you've been moderating several things. Appreciate you. And that is all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Payne. And before I will ask the commissioners to respond, I do want to take a point of privilege and I was reminded, and I already knew this, but Chair Harrington has to probably leave perhaps before the other commissioners. And so I wanted to make sure that she got her closing comments in before she leaves. So after this question from Ms. Payne is answered by whichever commissioners would like to answer that, I would like to give the floor to the chair. And then I will stay on as long as people need, but I want to make sure that even if we close it down, we give some grace to Chair Harrington. So thank you.
Sorry, I have 2 mute buttons. Thank you, Ms. Payne, for your comments. I really appreciate those. This goes to my closing comments that your Board of Commissioners has invested in more community engagement directly between ourselves and community members through tools such as this community investment conversation, our listening sessions, our town halls. Very different than the tools that prior commissions used. We will be getting a full report that will document all of your comments, all of your questions, and the various answers that you have given us today, as well as in the 3 prior sessions. I want to thank you again for accepting the invitation to participate in this community investment conversation series. It's not the last opportunity where we will be talking more with one another about these very pertinent needs here in our community. So I genuinely thank you for engaging with us. After all, county government is people serving people. We're here to serve you. I appreciate everything that you've contributed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Harrington. Commissioner Scouten, Commissioner Treese.
I think I very much appreciate the comments that were just made by our last speaker. I think trust and understanding and willingness to believe in each other and have confidence in each other's goodwill and integrity, I think are really going to be very important going forward, have always been very important, actually. We don't want to be swayed by racist demagogues, frankly, who have tried to play off of the totally uncalled for and totally unjustified violence that has occurred from time to time in downtown Portland. But those things cannot be excused, but robust First Amendment activities and protests is very much something that we should all celebrate and appreciate and appreciate each other and go forward as a nation and do better.
Thank you. Well, we are getting near the end, but I did want to go to the Q&A and ask Latricia if she had some searing questions that were, oh, wait a minute. Yes, Chair Harrington. Oh, okay. All right. Latricia?
Sure. I had a couple of questions that came in around how the board measures the impact of the investments that they make through the budget. And that's both in terms of immediate short-term impacts, in terms of service delivery outcomes, but also impacts that may be future implications for decisions made this year that may extend beyond a particular department. So how do you weigh that and how do you track that?
I will go ahead, Jack. I see you.
Maybe I'll take a shot for the second part of the question. I'll leave the commissioner's measure of the community impact for Commissioner Skelton and Commissioner Trees. With every year's budget, we don't just look at 1 year. We actually start with a general fund 5-year outlook, and then we do project out the investment today, and then how did that based on the factors that we know. This is actually the hardest part of my job, is to really look into the future and try our best to predict what is going to happen financially. And we actually do look at least 5 years to see where the investment today is going to shape the county's financial reality in the next couple of years. So hopefully that clarifies that question. And there is a general fund 5-year reserve forecast that is included with every budget summary every year. So I encourage community to look at that.
Maybe I should clarify the question. I think that the question relates to the ongoing conversation that we're having related to investing in public safety versus investing upstream in housing, health, and human services, and really wanting to know what are the impacts of various policy, like thinking about budget as policy. What are the impacts? What are the outcomes that commissioners are weighing as they're making those decisions?
Thank you very much. That's definitely a question I would yield to the commissioner to respond to. Thank you.
I think that's a great question. I don't think we've really done enough in that area, frankly.
I would, Commissioner Skelton, I would agree, but at the same time, I'd also like to point out that I think we have robust conversations and communications between the departments and the commission about what's happening and what they see in relationship to the community needs. So while it's not it tends to be a more qualitative type of analysis, the conversation is there in relationship to whether we're talking about homeless services, if we're talking about mental health, if we're talking with the sheriff's department. I do believe that we are getting a continual dialogue with those departments about what the needs are and where we are seeing progress and where we are seeing us not keeping up with the necessary needs in those areas.
Yeah, I think I agree with Commissioner Treese there, but I think what I was trying to say and still believe is I think maybe we should be more systematic or be more coherent or think through in a more quantitative way and in a more analytical way, more thoughtful way, what impacts and what performances we're expecting and what in fact we do get, and what the cost benefit analysis, how that actually plays out going forward.
Thank you, commissioners, and thank you, Jack, for your responses.
One final.
Oh, go ahead, Latricia.
Well, just in the interest of time, I have one final question that's a significant shift away from this conversation. There were a number of.
Ask it. This will be the final question, just to respect people's time. And anybody who had their hand raised, please put your comment in the Q&A so we can memorialize it and get you an answer. And anybody who put their answers in the Q&A or their questions, if yours is not the last question here, we will respond to those questions. And the very last thing, so I won't even have to come back except to say goodbye, there will be a poll that goes out immediately after we log off of this Zoom meeting. So all of those things, and now the culminating question of this wonderful Saturday session, community investment conversation in Washington County, Latricia Tillman.
And I think this is both a budget question and a policy question. And the question that came up several times is, why are taxpayer dollars paying for Ryan Alden's paid leave after the incident with Albert Molina?
That's an excellent question. And maybe I'll just speak from the logistical perspective, just because my department also involves HR, is that there are very specific HR laws and regulations that the county do not have a discretion about following or not following. We have to follow, be compliant with the law about employee conduct, and then what to do with employees in situations like this. So that is the reason why the county is definitely following the HR best practices and the state law compliance in treating this incidents or any other incidents when it comes to related with HR.
I hope that was responsive to the question.
You know, I'd like to take this just a little step further and say that I think all of us were shocked and dismayed by what we saw in that video. The public, the commissioners, and many of the people that work in the sheriff's department. It has been a long path that we've gone down with that issue. And the message I'd like to get to the public is that it's something that the commissioners feel and are very concerned about and working toward resolving as well and looking to the end date on this issue. But I also want to say that it has been a tremendous learning experience for all of us. That is not to diminish the situation and to say it's over. It's not over at all for those that were harmed in that situation. So I don't want it to just be reduced to a budget issue and to HR compliance issues. It's a human issue as well. Mr. Schouten, did you want to respond at all?
Yeah, I think you covered it pretty well. I think both of you. Part of the what makes working in policy interesting is that you try to solve a problem, you legislate, you provide new rules, new procedures, you do budgeting, and then there's unforeseen consequences, or there simply are other circumstances that also play, and you're constantly trying to balance between different considerations. I mean, on the other hand, we do want to support our employees engaged in high risk activity, doing important work. On the other hand, what we saw on that film video was not acceptable in a deep and profound way. But as I mentioned with the first part of it, we're also concerned that we support people who have to make very quick decisions in a very challenging environment. Can you put together rules and procedures that work well in all circumstances? No, that's very hard to do. We constantly wrestle with sort of rough justice, whether it's in terms of how we impose taxes and how we promulgate policy and how we budget. But we can always learn, we can always try to do better and try to strike a better balance than we have done before. And we can do that, I think, with more community involvement and make better decisions. And so we've been making some real steps forward procedurally to do that. And I think that will help us make better decisions as well.
Marcus, could I make my quick closing comments and then turn it to Commissioner Schouten, since this is his hosted event? I just want to thank everybody that's on the line. I want to thank our staff for making this possible, for answering close to 100 questions, for just working like crazy. So special thanks to all of you. But most importantly, I want to thank the participants here, because I believe that what we are seeing is an engaged population. We are seeing questions that are really thoughtful, good questions that push the commissioners to be considering all different aspects as we move forward in our policy work. When you contrast what we're doing on this Zoom session to other discussions around our region and around our country, this is so positive and so productive, and has provided at least me as commissioner with many things to think about and to ponder, and opportunities to discuss further with the residents of Washington County. So I am, as we approach the Thanksgiving season, I'm grateful for these types of interaction. I'm grateful for the hard questions that are being asked, the passion that is being displayed, and the engagement, and just the fact that our residents here are really interested in making this a safe, high quality place to live, to recreate, and to do our business. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Commissioner Schouten, the last word.
The last word will be brief, because I think Commissioner Treese did a great job of providing a closing statement. I will only say that I have enjoyed my 21 years on the board, and I look forward to seeing a new commissioner representing the Beaverton-Lowell area. And so all those questions and all those concerns, don't forget that in a month and a half, let's engage our newest commissioner as quickly as possible into the wonderful job of running this great county.
Thank you, sir. And thank everybody, just for people on the call. We had over 60, I believe, people just on the Zoom. We had even more out there on YouTube. Thank you to the Washington County residents for showing up and making sure that your commissioners work for you. So everybody enjoy their weekend. Thank you for coming, and we will see you next time. And don't forget to fill out the survey. Thank you.
Thank you.